Hey Lang nerds, welcome to eLang Explained. This video is a part of our core curriculum series where we break down some of the key concepts and pieces of metalanguage from units 1 to 4 English language. So get excited for today's episode where we're going to be learning some metalanguage and recapping some of our key sociolinguistic concepts. Get excited for today's video where we're going to be discussing one approach to unpacking the defining features of the set text. It's important to acknowledge that lots of different schools, students, and teachers have different approaches to identifying these defining features within any text. Today, though, we're going to be using the FIRTAC model. Now, FIRTAC organizes these defining elements of the text into the order that you can see on screen. So today, you're going to get a quick overview of the function, the intents and purposes, register, tenor, audience, and contextual factors. Remembering, of course, that contextual factors gets broken down into the cultural and situational context. Then we're going to conclude this video by having a look at a text that you probably haven't seen before to see if you can identify each element of the FIRTAC. Let's jump into function. Now, it's important to remember that when you see functions of language, you're only being asked about Jakobson's functions. And so our mnemonic device for today is MP-POC, because of course, Jakobson's functions include language that is metalinguistic, that is trying to clarify the meaning of language that is phatic, that is building a relationship that is reflecting the social distance, language that is poetic and showing that aesthetic quality to language that is referential and is trying to clearly state a fact or an opinion, and lastly, of course, language that is conative and is giving that direction to the audience or to the other participant to do or not do something. Then we have the purposes and intents. Now, these are the purposes and intents listed in the VCAST study design. It's important to remember as well that the informal purposes and intents are slightly different from the formal purposes and intents. And so for informal purposes, we're thinking about pens going beep. With our politeness strategies, with our purposes of politeness strategies, encouraging intimacy, negotiating social taboos, supporting in-group membership, building rapport, encouraging solidarity, encouraging equality, promoting social harmony, or promoting linguistic innovation. Whereas for our formal purposes, we're thinking about those RBC prop men. Remembering that formal purposes and intents can include reinforcing social distance, building rapport, clarifying information, promoting social harmony, reinforcing authority, obfuscating information, politeness strategies, manipulating information, establishing expertise, and of course, negotiating social taboos. Now, it's equally really important to remember that anytime you're talking about an intent or purpose, we always want to use these intents and purposes from this slide as sentence starters. So when we're talking about texts that encourage intimacy, for example, it's not enough to say that the text has a purpose and intent to encourage intimacy. We need to be clearly stating who that intimacy is encouraged between. Likewise, if we were talking about that formal purpose and intent of reinforcing authority, we need to really clearly state whose authority is being reinforced. In the same way, if we're talking about that purpose of clarifying information, it's really important to extend this purpose. So for example, this slide has an intent and purpose to clarify information about the informal and formal purposes and intents. Next up is register. Now, it's important to remember that register exists on a continuum and it's used to reflect how formal or informal the language used in a text is. When we're thinking about labeling register, we can label the register as informal, mostly informal with elements of formality. If it's flipped though, and the register is mostly formal, but you can see some little peaks of informality, then the register might be mostly formal with elements of informality. And for texts that predominantly use those formal language features, our register is formal. Next up in FIRTAC is tenor. Now, tenor is a new concept for the new study design, and it reflects the relationship between the participants in a discourse. As a concept, tenor includes three things. Number one, the role of each participant in the discourse. So when we're looking at a text, when we're considering a discourse, we should be thinking about what is the job of each participant? What are they expected to do? We also need to equally consider the social distance between our participants. Is this a close social distance or is it a little bit wider? And lastly, we need to consider the power that each participant in the discourse holds. Is there a superordinate who has the most power in the discourse, or Are we talking about a discourse where we have people who are equals, who have a similar or very equal share of power? The last thing we need to consider is the power that each participant in the discourse holds. And this is when we're thinking about whether or not there is a superordinate present, someone who has the most power or more power than other participants. We equally need to consider if we're looking at a text where each participant holds an equal level of power. When we're discussing tenor, it's a really good strategic choice to label the tenor of the text using an adjective that describes the relationship between participants to help set up your discussion of role, social distance, and power. So, for example, we might talk about a professional tenor or a friendly tenor and look at how each of those different tenors reflect the role, social distance, and power that the participants in the discourse have. Now, it's impossible to discuss tenor without also discussing and unpacking audience. And pretty obviously, the audience considers who the language in the text is directed at. Whenever you're analysing audience, it's a really good strategic choice to consider how language use reflects these four things. So we should be thinking about how the language used reflects the age of the audience. Are they older or younger? How the language used reflects the attitudes of the audience. Are we seeing a descriptivist or prescriptivist attitude? Remembering, of course, from units 1 and 2, that a descriptivist attitude refers to those people who believe that language change is not such a good thing, and they much rather prefer a standard language that they view as correct or most appropriate, rather than a prescriptivist whose attitude to language change is going to be much more accepting. Because, of course, prescriptivists believe that language change is inevitable and that language change strengthens our language as a whole. When we're discussing audience, we should also consider the interests of that audience and how we're seeing language used that reflects interest in a specific field. But equally though, we have to consider how the language used in a text reflects the education and prior knowledge required for the audience to fully understand and unpack this text. And so, of course, when we're analysing audience, we have to carefully consider what field are the audience already required to be a little bit educated in? What field does their prior knowledge need to come from? Now, lucky last in FIRTAC are our contextual factors. And this gets broken down into two different sets of context. The first is the situational context. And our suggestion is that you remember the mnemonic, friendly monsters take turns scaring. Because of course, situational context includes the field, mode, tenor, text type, and setting of the discourse. Whereas for cultural context, we're suggesting that you remember Viber. Because while the cultural context refers to the Australian culture where the discourse takes place, we can break this down further to look at the way that language features used in the text reflect the context's values, beliefs, identities, and attitudes. So, now we've gone over very briefly what FIRTAC stands for. It's time to apply this to a text. Today's text is taken from the Jetstar Australia Facebook page. It's their original post and then the pinned comment. I'm going to give you a moment to read this Facebook post and the comment, where Jetstar Australia are aiming to provide their customers with more information about their current sale on flights to Bali. Once you've had a read of this text, see if you can identify the function, the intent and purpose, the register, the tenor, the audience, and the context. So, how did you go identifying the FIRTAC? You can see here that we've said that the function is referential, although potentially you could argue a phatic function with language that is aiming to close the social distance between Jetstar and their audience. In terms of purpose and intent, we said that the primary purpose was to clarify information about Jetstar's sale on flights to Bali. But there equally could be a secondary purpose here of building rapport with Jetstar customers. The register, we definitely agreed that there were both formal and informal elements, but said that the register was mostly formal with elements of informality. In terms of tenor, we identified a tenor that was professional, but also friendly between Jetstar and their customers. Because as a brand, they are trying to establish themselves as the superordinate. They're the ones who have information about this sale and total control over the sale. But at the same time, they're trying to present an authentic brand identity that is friendly and approachable to their customer base. We said that the audience were Facebook users who were interested in booking flights to Bali, or potential customers of the Australian airline Jetstar who have already liked this page. In terms of context, we said that the field might be horoscopes or air travel, because that alliterative phrase, Mercury is in microwave, where we have the repetition of that phoneme for Mercury and microwave, is definitely a reference to the idea that Mercury being in retrograde is a time when things happen. But the rest of this post really focuses on that field of air travel. The mode is written. The tenor is professional and friendly, like we said earlier, with Jetstar being the superordinate, having the most power of any participant in this discourse, and that the text type was a social media post. In terms of the cultural context, obviously it's an Australian cultural context, but we're definitely seeing a descriptivist attitude towards language being used. And lots of language here that reflects that Australian value of authenticity, the idea that Jetstar is deliberately using language to reflect an authentic brand identity that is viewed positively as an approachable brand by their potential customers. These dot points are just a starting point for your analysis though. If you were going to write an AC on this text, you'd be aiming to discuss each of these elements of the FIRTAC in your body paragraphs. If you've identified something different from this list than is up on screen now, make sure to add it in the comments and share your perspective. But that's all we have time for today. Remember to be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.